see you all. Today we're going to talk a little bit about defending sentient beings. One of the things I did just to add to the discussion of the class is that I gave two handouts. One's just my talking points notes that I'm going to talk about tonight on the 6 paramitas, so you're more than welcome to have that. It's probably familiar to you. And then the other one is a text by Patrul Rinpoche. Many of you might know Patrul Rinpoche from the book Words of My Perfect Teacher. This is a text that he wrote about 9 considerations and criteria for benefiting beings, which I thought was interesting. We'll maybe touch on it a little tonight in a discussion. I find it interesting because Patrul Rinpoche, especially in his life, really was a manifestation of this notion of bodhicitta, this bodhisattva way of life. In fact, that was one of the main texts he always taught on, was the Bodhicharyavatara. And so having a text like this really does give us a little bit of guidance. And again, it's written from a male monastic viewpoint, so please be aware of that. But it's also very much in the lens of Tibetan culture and society as well. But I think if we really pull or extract the essence of what he's talking about in here, we can see that being applied into our own lives as well. And so what I wanted to talk about, we'll talk a little bit about the text here in a second on what can I do. And one of the things, maybe I'll just touch on it briefly, one of the reasons why I picked this text, what can I do? Because I think a lot of times when we are engaging in environmentalism or eco-Buddhism, or eco-Buddhism, not eco-Buddhism, but eco-Buddhism, I think a lot of times we might have this kind of feeling of like, well, what can I do? You know, the problems are so monumental, you know, any action I perform is just going to be a drop in the bucket. You know, what can I really possibly expect to have happen? And I think if thinking that way, we can also maybe feel a little overwhelmed or powerless in our efforts. And so I wanted to just take a moment to talk about a bodhisattva really quick, because we've talked quite a bit about Buddhism, and we've talked about different actions recently that we can do, and we've seen some actions like the Thailand's ecology monks, where they went around ordaining trees to prevent logging. We had Tucker come in last week and talk about political action and becoming involved in politics. But I really wanted to kind of bring us back to our root of this Bodhisattva Challenge, and that's the path of a Bodhisattva. So as we are on our spiritual path, in the traditional sense, what happens is our initial steps on this path are usually more focused on just turning our minds towards the Dharma, focusing on precious human birth, karma, defects of samsara, impermanence, things like that. Really getting our minds wrapped around just wanting to practice. Then we kind of have our preliminary practice, which is the 4 measurables: loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. This is where we start to really develop empathy in our own minds towards the sufferings of others. And it's really important that we lay that foundation, that groundwork, because from that arises or kind of flows out this path of a bodhisattva, of bodhicitta. And so in the notes, I basically have the path broken down in the traditional sense of the 6 paramitas. And paramita means perfection. So it's showing us the goal here. When we accomplish the paramita, we're enlightened beings. Until then, we are striving for the goal of this perfection. So don't feel like, oh my gosh, I can't love every sentient being right now. just understand or recognize we ourselves are a work in progress. So it's nice to have the goals and to stretch ourselves, but at the same time, you don't want to feel like it's so far away that you're just going to spin your wheels and not really accomplish anything. So in these 6 perfections or paramitas, we have what's known as generosity, discipline, patience, diligence, concentration, and then wisdom. Now, these things are taught separately, but understand that they are very much intertwined with each other. They're intertwined in the fact that if you were looking at, for example, generosity, and in generosity they divide it into 3 parts. So material giving, or giving of items, money, clothing, food, giving the Dharma, which is giving teachings, and then giving protection from fear. But at the same time, you can also look at discipline, where you have this conscientiousness, mindfulness, vigilance. You have patience, being patient when wrong, patience to bear hardships for the Dharma, the patience to bear the profound truth without fear. You have diligence, armor-like diligence, diligence in action, insatiable or unstoppable diligence. So if I'm practicing generosity, I should be practicing generosity with all these pieces in here. I should have patience in my generosity. I should have discipline in my generosity. I should have diligence. I should have concentration in my process. And then most importantly, I should have wisdom. So when we look at the 2 accumulations of means and wisdom, the first 5 are means or actions, the last one wisdom. But if wisdom isn't in generosity and discipline and patience and diligence, then it's not a true skillful mean. So I could be generous, but if I don't have wisdom in it, then I may not really be benefiting other sentient beings. And I think that's really important, especially in eco-dharma. Like, what can I do? There's a lot of actions we could take, but they may not be the most skillful actions available to us. And that's why I think it's important to think about this other text, the 9 consideration and criteria for benefiting beings, because what Patrul Rinpoche is trying to do is just give us a little wisdom in our actions. He's basically saying, here's what needs to be in place in order for you to practice generosity. So I may think, generosity is material giving, so I should give away all my possessions and then become destitute. Well, if I'm a beginner on the path and I have a lot of attachment to my own happiness, giving away all my possessions probably isn't going to be the smartest thing to do. I will may have resentment. I may find myself suffering because of that. And so giving away everything I own then may not be the best course of action. So then what else can I do? The other thing, like giving the Dharma, an example of that would be if I don't know the teachings, I'm not going to make them up and then just say, I know the teachings and I read my book here and now you have the teachings. In order for you to give the Dharma, you really have to understand it and kind of know its complexity, to the point that when you give the teachings, it's almost like the Dharma is flowing through you, not from you. A lot of times when you see master and student, they don't change the Dharma to meet like the times. What they do is they give the teachings according to how they received it. And then they may give a little bit of a commentary based off of those initial teachings to say how this can apply into our lives. So a lot of times they'll teach from what's called a root text, usually a sutra or maybe an ancient commentary. Then they'll use a commentary that's from a more recent author. And then they'll add a little bit of their own commentary. But a lot of times the teachers will be very specific, saying, this is what my teacher said. So like Words of My Perfect Teacher is all about, this is what my teacher said and I've written it down in a book. So that way when you read Patrul Rinpoche's book, you understand that these are the instructions he received from his teacher, not necessarily him giving his own advice and instructions. So we need to just be really kind of wise and understanding with our actions when we're on this path of the Bodhisattva, and especially when we're dealing with environmentalism, because it can be a very divisive topic for certain aspects. And if you know that it's divisive, you might be able to kind of put yourself into the fray in a bit skillfully, so that way you can, instead of becoming even more divisive, you can possibly reconcile the two sides and bring people to a balanced middle. But let's look at these paramitas really quick. So I've talked a little bit about generosity. The other one is giving protection from fear. The video that I showed Sunday, if you were here, there was a geshe. Unfortunately, it was kind of hard to hear because there was a lot of background noise in the video, but he was talking about liberating animals. And what he talked about was how people would buy animals from like slaughterhouses and other places to save their lives. There's also a practice in Asian countries where they'll release animals like fish and others into the wild. Lama Lena did that when she was here a couple of years ago. We had some crickets that we had bought from a pet store that were going to be food for snakes, and we released them outside. You know, it's this action of providing refuge or providing a sanctuary or some action to alleviate the suffering of another being. And that's what I think in this particular text here, Defending Sentient Beings, you kind of see the author Vanya Palmers' actions can really fall into this giving protection from fear. Like that was kind of his underlying understanding, where he talked about, he read that Peter Singer's book Animal Liberation, and that kind of inspired him, the actions that he then did in the rest of the essay. The other thing I think also with giving fear is then, you know, right now with like the coronavirus, COVID-19 going around, there's a lot of panic and fear in societies. And it's interesting that of all the practices His Holiness advised us to do was green Tara. Why do you think he advised us to do green Tara specifically? We just had a green Tara retreat. I don't know if anybody was there that remembers. What is green Tara? What is her main activity?
She gets rid of your fears.
Yeah, there are 8 great fears, right? And so there's kind of the outer manifestation of elephants and thieves and stuff like that, but there's also the inner aspect. And so it's interesting that His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, said that's the practice to do, because you really, and I'm going to assume it's intentional on his part, that what he's wanting us to do is practice a way to alleviate our own fears, so there's not the panic. You know, yes, the coronavirus is very contagious and has been causing a lot of health problems, but at the same time, there's been a lot more or a lot of ancillary problems due to the fear around that. So you see, like, of all things, run on toilet paper and other items, and it's just people freaking out. And just so, how can we as bodhisattvas, you know, really we have to also alleviate our own fear. Doesn't mean we have just a nonchalant attitude about it, like nothing could hurt us. That's where the skillful means part comes in, because then you still have to be wise and take and understand that, you know, there's due to causes and conditions, things arise. So due to causes and conditions, you can get sick, and by counteracting or preventing causes or conditions to arise, then you can prevent yourself from getting sick. AKA washing your hands, being just really intelligent about how pathogens get exchanged. You know, we're so big on washing hands, but we should always be big on washing hands and covering our mouths when we sneeze. Again, because it's not just the coronavirus, there's the flu and there's other illnesses that go through populations. And so it's really important to think about these things so that way we can provide the best possible conditions not to get sick, right? And that's this notion of green Tara alleviating our fears, allowing us to be kind of clearly seeing so that we're not affected by negative emotions or patterns or fears and stuff like that. The other one, and in my last part of this note, it talks about this notion of you should practice these according to your capacity. If you're a brand new practitioner, being able to liberate beings may not be to your capacity. They talk about giving your body. Sometimes people read some of these texts and think, oh my gosh, these bodhisattvas give their body. I could never do that. And they may have a lot of attachment. And so instead, you may want to do a practice like chud or some other practice where you're practicing a visualized form of giving. But I would also say giving of your body can also mean like putting your hands or putting your body into service for the service of others, giving blood, doing these other things that from your body benefit sentient beings. Not necessarily the whole thing. But they would say that high-level bodhisattvas would be able to completely give their body. There's stories of the Buddha who gave himself to like a hungry tigress and her cubs so that they would survive, And so we should read these stories as inspiration and take them as kind of a lesson that, there's ways that we can give that we may not necessarily see. A lot of times people feel like I can't give because I don't have a lot of money, but they're able to give like service, or they're able to give the Dharma or fearlessness. And I would say of all the forms of generosity, the most important is the form of giving the Dharma, because it's that old adage: you can give a person some fish, but it's better to teach a person how to fish, right? So that's the meaning behind giving the Dharma. It's great to benefit sentient beings, but it's even better to teach them how to benefit their own minds and tame their own minds. So, all right, the other ones are discipline, and this is refraining from harm. And so there's conscientiousness, mindfulness, and vigilance. So conscientiousness is a meticulous concern for what is to be engaged in and what is to be avoided. Right? The Sunday service, we read that prayer to the Buddha, and it says, do no harm, benefit others, tame your mind. Basically, it's the teaching of the Buddha. And that's what this means. The Dharma should allow us to know what to accept and reject as far as our behavior. Mindfulness means not forgetting what should be adopted and abandoned. And vigilance, which involves continually checking the status of your body, speech, and mind. And then this last part, I said, it says, firstly, through mindfulness, you do not lose sight of what should be adopted and abandoned. Then secondly, because you are checking the status of your body, speech, and mind with vigilance, you recognize any occasions when you are tempted to avoid something virtuous or engage in something negative. At that time, because of your conscientiousness, you recall the benefits of virtuous action and undertake them, or remember the faults of negative actions and unwholesome actions to avoid them. So, patience. Being patient when wronged, I think that's usually the most, when people think of patience. The other one is patience to endure the hardships for the Dharma. Benefiting beings can take a lot of effort. When you read Vanya Palmers' article or his essay in here, you really hear just some of the challenges he and others have gone through to benefit beings. And if you don't have the patience to deal with hardships, sometimes you can get very discouraged. And so we want to have just patience, even kind of with ourselves. And then patience to bear the profound truth of wisdom. This is a very big topic, but really to understand emptiness and of self and others, and be able to open yourself up to that, so that this kind of reifying self doesn't get kicked in. And this becomes the proficiency between like a beginner and advanced bodhisattvas. Bodhisattvas that can truly give their bodies have this patience for the profound truth of emptiness. They understand that this body is empty. Whereas a beginner, we don't necessarily have that deep understanding, so we still cling to self and others and their objects. Diligence is joy in what is virtuous. I always like that. A joy in practicing virtue. And again, when we're doing this Bodhisattva Challenge, what can I do? Well, one of the things we can do is actually have a little joy in this challenge that said, oh gosh, I have to give up, throwing away all my trash. Now I have to recycle. Ugh. But it's virtuous, so I should take that with a little bit of joy. And so there's arbor-like diligence, diligence in action, insatiable or unstoppable diligence. And this, which means really exerting yourself in the practice of the Dharma and fearing laziness with as much energy as someone who has discovered a poisonous snake in his or her lap, which are those first two. And then insatiable diligence is really just never being satisfied with a little or a few months or even years of virtuous practice, but really just exerting yourself over and over and over again. And I think this diligent piece can really help us with our own practice of this challenge of trying, if you try to be a vegetarian for a day, the diligence makes you try to be a vegetarian for the second day and on and on and on. And then finally, meditative concentration. So you have what they call childish concentrations. Really, this is, you're just kind of hiding yourself away from others. You're putting yourself away because you're attached to these experiences of bliss and clarity or absence of thought. There's the clearly discerning concentration, which is emptiness is clung to as an antidote. So this reification aspect, you utilize emptiness. And then finally, the concept-free samadhi of intrinsic reality. And then wisdom, you have the wisdom of hearing, reflection or concentration, and then through meditation. So, what can I do? Hopefully, did everybody read their text? I saw people in the corners reading fiercely, so I know you guys read a few words. So let's look at what some of the actions that Vanya, the author, and others did, right? So he kind of gives us a starting place. But what are some of the actions that he did in this particular text? He and others and his organizations and friends do.
One of the first things that inspired me was that his eyes were open while he was at the Tassajara Zen Center in San Francisco or that area. Mm-hmm. So I think initially just the fact that place was there, those causes and conditions were there for him to kind of discover and really be inspired, and then going back to Europe and starting a lot of activism. I thought that was pretty cool. Which ones did he do?
Well, there's a lot.
It was various forms of protest.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I'll say the first one I pulled out of here was they talked about giving talks, showed slides and videos, organized rallies, conducted anti-cruelty investigations, filed lawsuits, and networked with other concerned people. To me, I feel like this is really kind of most people's starting place is like, I want to get around with like-minded people to kind of power in numbers, but also, there may not be a lot that we can do at the initial piece, and so just doing talks, trying to bring awareness to an issue.
Well, studying it too, they talked all about learning about these factory farms and learning about the pigs' conditions and things like that. And if our eyes aren't open in a really kind of educated way, then we can just be kind of spouting without knowing. So I think that was one really interesting part too.
Well, that gets to Lama Lena's advice on pretty much anything Dharma related that, you really have to apply it, to understand it. And so he talked, and you're right, the students at the bottom of 313, the students of ethnology, animal behavior in Europe started projects in which pigs from commercially pig farm were released into a large, nearly wild territory, and with hours they started to behave just like their wild sisters and brothers, forming packs. And, because I think a lot of times when we are trying to perform actions, there's a lot of information out there, and not all of it's the best. So we want to make sure we vet it and really apply it and look at the research. Because if you're sitting there trying to work on animal liberation, you may have a lot of people who don't want that to happen. There's a lot of money in businesses with farming and slaughterhouses and stuff like that. Even switching over to like organic based foods, can cost more on the farmer. There's a lot of investment up front that they have to do. So what are some other things that they did?
Well, they took kids to the schools.
Yeah, I was just looking at that one, right? The little
Yeah.
piglets.
Yeah, the little piglets.
Trying to get people to understand that what they're eating are animals. And there's this notion of empathy that they're
Yeah.
trying to develop.
I mean, how many people who eat pork have ever, held a baby kid?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've never held a baby pig. I don't think I'd ever want to hold a baby anything, except for my grandson. That's different. What else did they do? Definitely a lot of rallies, but then they also started getting into some film production, creating these films. They talked about how they created these like little 45-second spot films where they show the free-range pigs versus pigs that are in these cages and in the farms. And I think a lot of times you see a lot of that footage anytime you watch a video on not eating meat. They always show you the happy animals versus the ones that are in the slaughterhouse to show us. Because again, if we're in a city environment, we're probably not getting out to a farm or a slaughterhouse anytime soon. The closest we're getting to a cow is the leather we wear or the food in the supermarket, unless we make a concerted effort. But then they also did a friend, they said in Russia about fur farming, right? So not only the pig farm, which it seemed like was Vanya's real big push, but also other aspects.
I like how they closed it out with the persuasiveness of they go to dinner and this person orders vegetarian, everyone else orders very, very meat heavy with this group, and rather than kind of putting them on the spot or embarrassing them or like chastising them, it's later that there's a conversation after the fact with kind of persuasive pictures and some follow-up about, have you thought about this? And the reason that stuck out is when I first gone out to California and then was in the Enigma group there, I learned the story of why they were vegetarian. So that's how I started being a vegetarian, because I was in an environment where everything that was served was vegetarian. So it was very easy to transition that way. And I got to see how good food, vegetarian food could be. But I learned that originally this retreat center was not the case. They would serve meat for quite a while, and it was started by somebody from Tibet and India, so having that tradition of eating meat. But it was the daughter of Tartang Tolku that this is as the story goes around our community, that the daughter presented. This is the how meat is produced in America. This is the factory farms. This is the slaughterhouses. This is how it's done here. And ever since then, all the organizations have been just vegetarian. So she persuaded her father that, just like this author did at the very end. And it had, think of how many animals were saved from that, because there's multiple communities that live together and stopped serving meat. So that had a huge effect.
Yeah, and I think anytime we just sit and think about it, this aspect of empathy has to arise. and I was asked to kind of talk about becoming a vegetarian myself. And so one of the things, my wife has been a vegetarian ever since I've known her. And, so anytime we would eat, when I was eating meat, I would have to cook separately from her. That was always frustrating. But she never, it was interesting. Every time we went out, we would go to restaurants. She would never complain or worry about, do they have a vegetarian option or not? And I was like, wow, I never really gave it much thought. And then for work, I started traveling kind of through Kansas. And if you ever go past central Kansas west, you'll start to see a lot of stockyards. And then I would have to go to Liberal and Garden City. And there's a road that's between them. And Liberal actually has the National Meat, I think is the company, that it's their slaughterhouse. And this entire town stinks of just like rotten blood. It's so disgusting. And I couldn't imagine somebody trying to live there, especially on like a really warm, like August. I would go out there in August and it would just be, your eyes would water. And this company that I work for, their office is, a couple of blocks away from this place. And it's just terrible. And then I would drive up to Garden City, and there would be, as you're driving, you would see this huge kind of stockyard with all these cows, and there's like no room. They are packed in there, and they would have like a little mound, and you would see like a cow standing on top of that mound, and other cows are just, it's crazy, and just a ton of mud and dirt, and it was just, it's like, how do they ever get that out of, like, when they talk about, contamination of meat, I'm like, well, how is it not contaminated every second of the day? I mean, it's ridiculous. And so I think from that experience, and then when I became the spiritual director here at the Remate Center, I really felt like I couldn't eat meat. I just couldn't. Like, I couldn't be a spiritual director and then have a steak or eat fish or anything like that. And so I became a vegetarian, and I realized quickly how difficult it can be if you're not really committed to the practice. Like, I can understand how people fall off the wagon very quickly when you go somewhere. But what's really nice, especially in our society, is there's so many options for vegetarian food that you could be a vegetarian and not really think about being a vegetarian. You just eat all these foods that are amazing that don't have meat. It's pretty simple. And now they have meat alternatives like Beyond and Impossible and Garden Burgers and stuff like that. That occasionally when I want to have a good burger, I just eat one of these plant-based patties, and I've had my burger and I move on. So it's not like it was really, really difficult, but I could definitely see how people could struggle. And then the other thing is, at that time I had read a book called Food of the Bodhisattvas by Shabkar, and I'll bring it next week. Shabkar was a Tibetan that lived around the time of Patrul Rinpoche, so a couple hundred years ago. And he was a vegetarian in Tibet. So you always have people saying, oh, well, Tibetans eat meat because of the climate and everything else. But that's not necessarily true. I mean, I'm sure for the vast population that's the case in order to have nutrition. But you would have Shabkar and others who would be vegetarians and live their whole lives as vegetarians, never once eating meat. So it is possible. And what's interesting in the Food of the Bodhisattvas, that's the English title, is that there's two texts in there. The first text, Shabkar uses a lot of scriptures and really uses a lot of commentarial texts from the great Buddhist saints and scholars to demonstrate that the Buddha never really the Buddha explained that people shouldn't eat meat. And then the second half was his own kind of writing about vegetarianism. And what's really interesting is because in that text, he takes every argument and just cuts right through it. He says, this is the reason why you say you eat meat, but that's not the case. That's not true. That's a wrong view. Or that's, you're fooling yourself in a sense. And really what it comes down to is you eat meat because you desire meat. There's a craving there. And I think that really gets back to the essence of what the Buddha talked about. It was that the fact that we suffer because of the harm that we cause to ourselves and others, because we don't really, of unknowing or ignorance or delusion. And because of that, we have attachment and aversion. And that craving for meat, and we all have cravings. I mean, that's just the nature of the human condition. But when you really look at it, it's that grasping at self. I'm hungry, I want meat, I want this. And so that's what Shabkar was kind of pointing to, was this notion of this innate craving and grasping. Because if you really look at that, then you start to look at like the meat industry, like factory farms, and they talk about humane butchering, but you're killing an animal. So I don't care how much you hug them and sweet talk them, as soon as you shoot them in the head, where's the humanity or where's the empathy in that aspect? My wife was telling me she had read an article where they were talking about how some people are getting around free range because instead of chickens being in a tiny little thing, they give them, 6 feet to walk back and forth, and that's considered free range. Is that, you think, is that really free range? So instead of having to worry about, am I meat coming from ethical sources, you just don't eat meat. And again, next week we'll be showing a video or a movie called A Prayer for Compassion, and it's an interfaith video. But in this, they bring up that same concern. If you truly say in your spiritual tradition or in your heart, and I think in the video I shared with our email, and I think Matthew Ricard said the same thing. If you really truly say you want to benefit sentient beings, but then you go eat them, how there's a disconnect somewhere that we, as Buddhists, we have to look at. And I don't, for those of you who eat meat, I don't want you to feel like, oh my gosh, I have to be a vegetarian in order to be Buddhist. But what I really want you to do is observe your mind and say, well, why? If I have, again, and I talked about this Sunday, if you have 2 options, and every place now has 2 options, there's not really a restaurant. You can even go to a steakhouse, which I taken my wife to many, many times, who was a vegetarian. I'm such a jerk of a husband, now that I look at it. And she would be sweet, and she would order vegetarian food at a steakhouse or at some other place. Options would be limited, but it's possible. So if we have to look at our own minds and say, the 4 immeasurables, I want all sentient beings to be happy. But if it doesn't include non-humans, is it truly immeasurable? So, but it takes a little bit of work. That compassion and that loving kindness has to radiate out. But it's important that we really try to open our hearts and minds to other beings. Hi.
Just a question.
Yes.
Vegetarian or vegan?
Yeah.
Which?
Well, now I'm trying to become vegan. And the reason behind it is the video that we're going to watch next week. Because with vegetarianism, I really didn't want to have animals harmed. Thinking, dairy cows are fine. eggs are fine because it's a unfertilized egg.
Maybe.
But then if you look at the conditions, so like with dairy cows, one, they're artificially impregnated so that they keep producing milk. So there's a lot of harm to the cow. And then when the dairy cows stop producing milk, what happens to them? Yeah. Yep, exactly. They're no longer useful. And then same thing with chickens. Even with the eggs, there's the culling of male little chickens, baby chicks. So even in that aspect, even though it's an unfertilized egg, do you still need to eat it? Because in a sense, you're still, even though with like an egg, it may not have direct impact because it could be a truly free-range chicken and they're eating the eggs that are naturally produced, but still it supports an overall industry that could be causing harm. And again, I am a work in progress when it comes to being a vegan. So, I've found it easier with dairy, not so much with eggs. So, but I don't beat myself up over it.
I have friends who grow their own chickens and they don't slaughter them. Is that okay?
I'm not the one to tell you it's okay or not. I mean, it's not like, and that's the thing we need to understand with Buddhism. It's not like the Buddha's holding it over us and saying, oh, you evil, evil person, you're going to hell. We have to understand that we need to look at the intention behind our actions. So again, if somebody's raising chickens humanely and they're free to wander as they go and the chickens lay eggs naturally and they're unfertilized, that's not for me to say that's bad or not. But I would say it's up to us to look at farming practices that do harm animals. So, and I would say the demand for eggs probably wouldn't be sustained by people who have that free-range chicken. They're probably not producing enough eggs to satisfy the demand of eggs in our country.
What if the chicken dies of old age?
Yeah. So, I mean, the Buddha, if you want to go out there and eat old dead chickens, go for it. I mean, the Buddha basically laid down explicit rules that basically says you should not eat meat if you know it's been slaughtered for you, in a sense. There's conditions to it. So a lot of times people say, oh, well, but I just go to the supermarket. That thing wasn't killed for me specifically. But then you have to look and say, well, was it because you as a consumer, technically it was. They weren't slaughtering the cow not to be consumed by consumers. So by you going out and buying meat, you're still buying something that was slaughtered for you as a consumer of meat products.
I think the funnest part about being a vegetarian is, like, for me it stopped being a sense of renunciation of meat, and I have found some of the best recipes ever, and I have found some of the coolest vegetables ever that I never would have used if it was always a piece of chicken with a potato and a green bean. I mean, now that seems like the most boring plate ever. And I even had a good friend of mine write a whole plant-based bowl recipe, like a Buddha bowl recipe book. And oh my gosh, when I sit there and I put it together, I remember, Fred's amazed by some of the things that have come out of this book. And another of my secret hack, and I did bring in one free thing, but I started to use some of the recipes from HelloFresh, and they send you a box, and you can choose vegetarian, and it's cheaper, and they give you the portion sizes, there's always the balance of a waste because it's a little, plastic bag with 2 garlic cloves in it. But I think for me, I'll just do it every 3rd week. I'll get a box and I get all new ideas of recipes, and I get 3 new recipe cards that you keep, and you get the exact portion, so there's no food waste because you only get, the 1 onion you need, and you only get the 2 garlic cloves you need. So there's not anything that goes bad there, but I've come up with some amazingly new recipes because I had started to get a little stale with pasta and lentils and and things, and I've just been and my husband, I don't know that he considers himself a vegetarian, but he doesn't eat meat at our house, and he's been very, very impressed with what we've come up with. So I've only found it to be better and better as I get more into it and take some time into it.
Yeah, I would say I would rather people not say they're not label themselves as vegetarian vegans and just choose vegetarian options.
Sure,
yeah. That was the thing that I think really helped me, was I never really was like, I am a vegetarian. I just chose not to have vegetarian options. The important thing, and one of the things that Shopkar really kind of talked about, was this notion that it's not necessarily the question, but what if it died of natural causes, or what if it does this, or what if it meets that criteria? The question is the grasping mind. Why can't you choose a different option? What is driving you so much to eat that particular whatever it is? I would say that's a good practice to do, even for healthy eating overall. Trying to cut out sugar. Watching your mind grasp at sugar. Even like ice cream or fatty type of foods or chips. Foods that may not be the healthiest for you. Just being mindful. And that's why I thought it was interesting that I started with that aspect of the paramitas, right? Of discipline, conscientiousness, mindfulness, and vigilance. Having those 3 things, when you're trying to look at your behavior and saying, am I being conscientious of not eating meat, sugar, fatty foods, whatever it is that your mind grasps to, because that's the important thing, is the grasping that Shopkar really looked at, and he was applying that logic with meat and animal products. And next week we're really gonna get into a discussion about a plant-based diet, and we're actually gonna have a couple people. One lady, Dr. Carmen, is actually interviewed in the movie. She's going to be here, and there'll be a little bit of a discussion afterwards. It's a school night. It's going to be a little late, so I understand people have to leave. But she'll be here to talk about it. There'll be another person who I think it's with this probably is not correct, but I think it's the Kansas City Vegan Coalition that will be here too to help talk about like a plant-based diet. And I think when a lot of times when people say, it's too hard to be a vegan, or it's too hard to be a vegetarian, one of the things I notice that they do is they say, well, it's more about just eating a plant-based diet. Using that. And most of everything that I've found, there's so many arguments on both sides, and both seem very valid, but that's why Shopkar's instructions come back to the forefront. It's like, but it's your mind grasping. And as long as your mind grasps, that's where you have to apply wisdom of emptiness at that grasping thing. And I think as Buddhists, we really need to apply wisdom in order for any action to be a skillful means. When you feed yourself, you shouldn't be feeding yourself off a desire. You should be feeding yourself off the wish that this body is healthy so that it can benefit other sentient beings. Not, I'm hungry, I need to eat. In fact, there's prayers that you could do that say, may this food be medicine to keep me in health. There's, in the Zen tradition, and I don't know if Mei-Zen and Hazy Moon does that, where they eat and everything goes in the bowl, and then at the very end they put water where you kind of wash the bowl and you drink that as well. I don't know if she...
Yes, we do.
Yeah. And there's something really beautiful about that practice as well, because I think for most of us we think, ugh, that's food residue, that's gross. But it's still sustenance to the body. You're not wasting anything.
We refer to it as ambrosia.
Ambrosia.
Yeah.
It's a nice way to give it a...
There's a special prayer that you say as you're doing this, and you refer to it as ambrosia.
I wonder if we have that prayer in this text. I know we have...
There's a lot in the back.
Yeah. Meal verses. Here we go.
448.
Yeah, I'm looking at 496. This is the meal verses by Thich Nhat Hanh.
I think the pages are different on
Oh, are they? Okay, I'm sure it is.
Yeah, it's the same.
Yeah, meal verses
Yeah.
is the title of it.
What'd you say?
448.
448.
It starts with blessing the meal. This food is the gift of the whole universe. That one.
Yep. Yeah. So at the very beginning, right? So Geshe-la does a food blessing, and his food blessing is basically the Buddha is the supreme teacher, the Dharma is the supreme refuge, the Dharma or the Sangha is the supreme are the supreme guides. May this food be offered to the three jewels. That's what his blessing translates to roughly. Here, Thich Nhat Hanh shares, and I'm a big fan of a lot of things Thich Nhat Hanh. So the blessing of the meal, this food is a gift of the whole universe, the earth, the sky, and much hard work. May we live in a way that makes us worthy to receive it. May we transform our unskillful states of mind, especially our greed. May we take only food that nourishes us and prevents illness. May we accept this food so that we may realize the path of practice. That second to the last line, may we only take food that nourishes us and prevents illness. When we think about that, we can really look at, what foods don't cause illness. And a lot of times it's usually plant-based type foods. I don't know about you, but I think when you eat a meat-heavy diet, there's a lot of issues with high blood pressure and cholesterol. I know. Yeah, like eggs, for example. Eggs were the devil for many. I remember growing up as a kid, and people would say, "Don't eat eggs; they're high in cholesterol." And I think I was 8. I was like, "What's cholesterol?" There's a lot of diets out there. They kind of look at this notion of where they try to look at reducing the consumption of meat. But then there you also have a lot of diets that are just like, oh, meat, and more meat. That's because they have a lot of desire. No, I'm just kidding. All right, so then filling the plate. My plate, empty now, will soon be filled with precious food. Seeing the full plate. In this food, I see clearly the presence of the entire universe supporting my existence. Sitting down to eat. Sitting here is like sitting under the Bodhi tree. My body is mindfulness itself, entirely free from distraction. Before the first bite, many beings are struggling for food today. I pray that they may all have enough to eat. Contemplating the food. This plate of food, so fragrant and appetizing, also contains much suffering. The first 4 mouthfuls. With the first taste, I promise to offer joy. With the second, I promise to help relieve the suffering of others. With the third, I promise to see others' joy as my own. With the fourth, I promise to learn the way of non-attachment and equanimity. Upon finishing the meal, this plate is empty, my hunger is satisfied. I vow to live for the benefit of all beings. Holding up a cup of tea. This cup of tea is in my 2 hands. Mindfulness is held uprightly. My mind and body dwell in the very here and now. So to me, I feel like practices like this really tie us into the teachings in relationship with food, which isn't a bad thing. Because if we truly want to benefit beings, we have to work with these teachings on, the Buddhist teachings of like the 4 immeasurables, the 6 paramitas, and using prayers in our activities bring us back to those time and time and time again, so that we really develop equanimity. Tokyo Yeshe says, if you try to be a vegetarian every other day, or try to be a vegetarian in the morning, take some aspect. And again, you don't have to subscribe to labels. You could just say, you know what, for my breakfast, I'm going to eat a plant-based diet. Well, guess what? Eat oatmeal. And if you use cream in your coffee, use a non-dairy creamer. While I'm switching or becoming more vegan or of kind of the full plant-based diet, one of the things I found that I've discovered that I absolutely love is non-dairy cream cheeses. Because I've always felt like dairy cream cheeses always kind of made me feel kind of heavy in the morning and just kind of, I don't know if I had a dairy allergy or what, but it just, they were good. They satisfied my taste buds, but just me. And these non-dairy cream cheeses are delicious. Like it's like putting jam or something on. It's not like you miss having the cream cheese. It's just I'm putting something else on, and I don't even think of it like as a non-dairy cream cheese. I just think of it as this wonderful little tasty nut butter, basically. Because most of the time, I just love that word, nut butter. Except it's not chocolatey nut butter like Nutella. It's usually made with almonds or some coconuts. And I understand there's some issues around other farming practices with almonds and things like that. But again, it's right now my focus, and this is where it's a work in progress, my focus is on not having beings suffer just so I can stay fat. And that's why when I wrote King's Little Backrest, it reminded me of that. So
it reminds me of when I was in between jobs and at one of those job places, a whole bunch of people were there who used to work for a company that made food out of chemicals.
Oh.
It tastes, different things
Yeah.
to taste, and then actual things that you could pick up and eat. But it was all chemists that put it together.
Isn't it like aspartame and sweet and low and all those?
No
They're
worse
like,
than that. Oh, it was.
oh, was it?
Oh, yeah.
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 I would say that's also why you want to read your food labels. Keep it simple. Not having overly processed. And unfortunately, with like some of the meat substitutes, like the veggie burgers and stuff like that, they're highly processed items. So, real quick, I also just wanted to talk about these 9 considerations and criteria for benefiting beings. This is a text that I really appreciate, because I think sometimes, especially when we are beginning on the path, we may have some crossroads. Should I do this or should I not do that? And that's what Patrul Rinpoche is trying to do. So he gives, the first one is consideration of the benefit to both oneself and others. And I had highlighted here, if something would harm you but help others, then act in accordance with your situation. If you are a beginner, the main thing is to protect yourself from harm. Like the shoot of a medicinal plant, protecting yourself from harm will be the source of benefit to others. If you are a bodhisattva at the stage of devoted conduct, weigh up the priorities. From the point of obtaining the bodhisattva levels onward, the main thing is to act solely for others' benefits. So a lot of times we'll read these texts and we think, oh my gosh, how could I ever do that thing? But what Patrul Rinpoche is telling us is like when you're beginning on the path, you really got to just, you're working on yourself right now. So if a homeless person came up and said, hey, can I have the keys to your house so I can have a house? You're probably not going to, it would not be wise to say yes if you're not in that type of high level bodhisattva, which I think most of us are probably not. The better thing would be to find another skillful means to help them, whether it's finding them a shelter or something like that. Something, the homeless outreach, I think, is probably a best example of skillful means, because a lot of times when I talk about generosity, I always do the activity of, would you give a homeless person $1? Most people say, sure. Okay, what about 20? I don't know about that. Well, what's the difference? Why would you change your mind? And then all of a sudden you have this whole story that develops, whatever the story is. You have some kind of story that develops. And so instead, and that's the kind of grasping aspect, instead we give food. It doesn't matter how homeless they are or how addicted to drugs or whatever their story is, everybody needs to eat. So when you give food, that's kind of like what Patrul Rinpoche is saying here. You're not able to give $20, but you can give food. And so give according to your capacity, or do these actions according to your capacity. So if you're grasping at eating meat, becoming a full vegetarian is not going to be the wisest course. What would be the wisest course is really what Tulku Yeshe talks about. Give it up for a meal. Make your breakfasts plant-based. That's pretty easy to do. Or make a lunch or a dinner plant-based. And just start to really expand your capacity to eat a plant-based diet without really grasping onto or desiring meat. And then really understanding, why am I eating this plant-based diet? It's so that I benefit other sentient beings. So that my actions, whether directly or indirectly, aren't the cause of harm for other sentient beings. He goes on that first page, he says, you should also examine the amount of help or harm that would be caused, if directly or indirectly. If it would be considerable help to others and a little harm to yourself, you should act in benefit of them. If it would be a little help to others but would seriously harm you, do not act. If the amount of help and harm would be equal, act in accordance with your situation. If you are a beginner, mainly protect yourself from harm. From the stage of devoted conduct onwards, mainly act to help others. You see a pattern forming here with his instructions. Considering the status of beings. So this is like high level beings like the God realm to lower level beings like the hell realms. He talks about the consideration of the number of beings. So if you help a few beings but harm a lot of beings, you wouldn't want to act that way. If you may harm a few beings but it benefits a countless number of beings, then that might be something you would want to act. But again, it's always to your own capacity, to your own aspirations. Consideration. The fourth one is consideration of this in future lives. Fifth one is consideration of vows and non-virtue. This is one that I think is really interesting with the Bodhisattva path. So we have this in the Pranamoksha vows: don't kill, steal, sexual misconduct, lying, and intoxicants. Right, these 5 things. Here he gives like examples of when you could go against those outer battles. So he gives such like if somebody is going to kill a large group of people out of their own self-interest, then you could take that person's life. And I like to think of the story of in one of the Jataka tales of the Buddha, where he was a ship captain, and there was someone on that ship who was going to murder everybody on there. And so the Buddha thought to himself, this being out of attachment and aversion is going to harm all these sentient beings, and is going to create just this incalculable number of karma. Instead, I will kill him because I'm trying to save all these beings, but I know I'm going to take karma on myself as well. And so instead, he takes the karma of killing one person, and that way that other person doesn't take on the karma of killing all these other beings. The second one is about stealing if something's been stolen. There's this really wonderful story I just read. I'm reading this. Tibetans love zombie stories, if you can believe it. They call them rolongs, and it's a type of literature that comes out of India, and Tibetans love it. They won't admit to it. I don't know, maybe they will. But when I asked Tibetans, you can see they get kind of a glint in their eye when you talk about it. So there's this book I bought, and in it's a zombie story, but it tells karmic tales or fables. And so one of the karmic fables is there's this guitar player who has this magical ring, and this merchant wants the ring, so the merchant swindles it through card games, and it's stolen from the guitar player. And the guitar player's just beside himself, destitute that he lost this magical ring. And so his companion, who is a cat, which is one of the reasons why I like the story, has a friend who's a mouse. And so the cat goes to the mouse, and then the mouse sneaks into the merchant's tent and then steals the ring back and gives it back to the guitar player, who then is overjoyed that he has the ring back. So anyway, that reminded me when I read this little piece. And it's the year of the mouse, so why not? Right? So falsehoods. If there was somebody who was fleeing for their life from a mob and they came here for solitude, or let's say, our government who's trying to round up people right now. We had, migrants who were living here, and immigration came and wanted to put them into camps, and they say, "Are those people in your building?" And I'm going to say, "No. They went out the back door." I'm speaking a falsehood at that time, in order to prevent harm from being caused to the people. This is just examples. What does the Catholic Church call it? Asylum, I think. The kind of notion that they're having it, and then the government wouldn't be able to. Nowadays, they would just knock down the doors and probably drive them out anyways. But so there's this notion that when you can really truly benefit of being, if the outward conduct goes against your vows, as long as you are doing that with a mind towards enlightenment and benefiting beings, there's the possibility that you could perform that action. I would say if there's even the slightest self-grasping, then you can't do that action. And when you read this, I would actually tell you that kind of gets back to that first criteria, that if you are a beginner on the practice, maintain your outer vows, and not do actions that would cause harm. Because he goes on and he talks about other things, talks about stealing from the rich to give to the poor, and I thought of Robin Hood when he gave that little example. I wonder if Tibetans have Robin Hood. So anyways, this is a great text. Look it over. There's aspects of considering the pros and cons of generosity, and I think I had already talked about that a little bit. Consideration of being's various levels of devotion. So am I not worried about practicing the Dharma or any kind of spiritual path? Am I a Bodhisattva? Am I on the Tantric path? Different things like that. And then they give a kind of a summary as the 8th, and the 9th is a consideration of the pros and cons for your own Dharma practice. So if you do actions that upset or bring your mind out of balance, then stay away from those actions. But the important thing, especially for the wisdom aspect, is what they say, the emptiness of the three spheres. Any action we do, we should really see the emptiness of the object, the emptiness of the self, and the emptiness of the action. And they talk about that at the kind of the back of the text. Any questions, comments?
Just the definition of a sentient being.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Sentience.
Sentience. The hesitancy to eat animals is because they're sentient beings.
Mm-hmm.
And plants and life is not a sentient being?
Well, I would say the notion of sentience is consciousness. And that's where modern science is actually kind of intriguing, that has a lot of, because you start to see kind of this sentience aspect of like trees and other things like that. So I would say there's also an aspect of you do have to live. So maybe even reduce, if you're concerned about the sentience of plants, really trying to eat modestly or moderately, don't overindulge, recognize the interconnection of all sentient beings. The other argument I hear a lot about is like, what about all the insects that die in the cultivation of plants? Again, there's a lot of what ifs. The important thing, and that's why I always go back to Shatkar. What's your intention, and what's your mind grasping at when you're eating food? And I think that's what's important. And just understanding that, just like our body, speech, and mind, our actions have an impact on sentient beings, and we want to have an impact on sentient beings, whether it's humans working with the penal system or other social justice movements to benefit other sentient beings. At the same time, our food habits can be looked at too, and how those impact sentient. But that's a good question. Again, I am not the one to answer that question. You have to come up to that question.
I've heard another Buddhist group talk about a sutra that's called the Eventual Enlightenment of Plants. So if plants can reach enlightenment, they're kind of like sentient beings.
Yeah, I'm not aware of that sutra, but yeah, that'd be. I mean, there's this notion of, especially in certain teachings, that everything has aspects of enlightenment. Like minerals and rocks and stuff like that. The important, you can also look at the schools of emptiness and understand that, the world around us is also interconnected with our own mind. So by working with the interplay of phenomena around us, how are we engaging in that kind of ecstatic dance of spontaneous arising from emptiness is our intention and our grasping or aversion to things, so that's what we're working on, not necessarily some of these more finer details. But on an outer sense, though, especially with the Bodhisattva, it's all about developing empathy and open-heartedness towards all sentient beings, maybe even plants, and not, I would say that's a great, that example is demonstrated by a couple of weeks ago with the Thailand's ecology monks, how they're ordaining trees to prevent them from being just harvested left and right, that they're trying to show the sacredness of that particular forest in relationship with our life. Geshe-la, when he spoke, I think about a month ago, talked about how Tibetans see like spirits and other things residing in mountains, and they see nature as sacred. The problem, and I just feel with my own relationship with our culture, is that we've lost the sacredness of the world around us. And I think what happens is the Buddhist teachings pull us back into that sacredness with nature. And we see that our actions can cause harm, and so we have to bring our own actions of body, speech, and mind into balance so that we're not intentionally harming other beings. And I think the intentional aspect is there. Intention due to our grasping or aversion. So.
The thing that struck me, because I started thinking about this the last time we were here, was that to me is the key, the intention, the sacredness of life. Because the Plains Indians, the buffalo was their food, it was their clothing, it was their housing, but they looked upon the buffalo as a sacred being. And that is what we're trying to get to. Whatever we eat is sacred. And it, they were eating meat, but they had a whole different idea of, thanking that creature for everything they needed.
Yeah.
And so it's not too far-fetched.
Well, and again, I really feel like just to be soft with ourselves and say we are a work in progress. You know, we're taking steps. You know, we may not be there yet, but let's do actions today. And this, all actions, not just animals. You know, how we interact with others around us. You know, last week we talked about political actions that can be very divisive, and you can have strong feelings against other people. Don't have strong feelings against other people, have against their ideas, and understand that those people are wanting love and happiness just as much as we are, and to try to open our hearts to them. And what happens is those hard walls that we put up, you know, start to fall down, and we're able to really connect and communicate with others. So, all right. Any other? It's 9:07, so I don't want to take any more time. But is everybody okay? Next week we're going to have the film showing, so please come for that. Again, it's going to talk about that aspect of sacredness of other beings.
Can you remind us, does the film time start at 7:45?
7:45. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep.
And you were thinking some people might go to Pirate's Bone before?
Yeah, I was thinking it would be maybe nice if we could go to Pirate's Bone. It's a vegan restaurant down the road. It's walk, well, if you don't want to walk too far, I would drive. But it's just about, I would say 6, 7, 8 blocks away. And it's a burger place, so it's a really wonderful place. And they got little burgers if you want to try a vegan burger, if you've never had one before, a plant-based burger, to do it. I mean, they're really delicious. And they have different kinds, so you can